Hi, my name is Hannah Batzel, and I'm a Chicago area book artist and a member of the Caxton Club. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers, Rebecca Romney and Heather O'Donnell. Rebecca Romney's career in rare books has taken her across the country and into unexpected places. She was a bookseller and manager at Bauman Rare Books in Las Vegas and Philadelphia for 8 years, then a principal at Honey and Wax Booksellers in Brooklyn for 3 years, before co-founding the Washington, D.C.-based rare book firm Type Punch Matrix in 2019. Since 2011, she's appeared as the rare book specialist on the History Channel's show Pawn Stars. In 2016, she helped to found the ABAA's Women's Initiative, and in 2019, she was featured in the documentary The Booksellers, which premiered at the New York Film Festival at Lincoln Center. Rebecca is the author of a book on books entitled Printer's Error: Irreverent Stories from Book History, co-founder with Heather O'Donnell of the Honey and Wax Prize, and editor of the new science fiction anthology Projections. Heather O'Donnell founded the Brooklyn-based rare book firm Honey and Wax Booksellers in 2011 after an early academic career and 7 years in the New York Gallery of Bauman Rare Books. In 2016, she helped to found the ABAA Women's Initiative. The following year, she and Rebecca Romney established the annual Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize of $1,000 for a young woman book collector. She's featured in The Booksellers, the 2019 documentary on the New York book trade. Heather serves on the ABAA Board of Governors, the faculty of the Antiquarian Book Seminar, the vetting committee of the New York Winter Antique Show, and the Yale Library Associates Trustees. In tonight's presentation, Rebecca and Heather will reflect on their participation in outreach programs designed to address marginalization in the rare book world, including the Women's Initiative of the ABAA, the Antiquarian Book Seminar, and their own Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize for young women collectors. These programs, in addition to recent initiatives created by the Rare Book School, the Bibliographical Society of America, and RBMS, are part of a broader movement to attract and support booksellers, collectors, librarians, and archivists from communities historically underrepresented in the rare book world. In discussing what they have learned from recent projects, and their hopes for new ones like the ABAA Diversity Initiative, Rebecca and Heather will consider the successes and challenges facing these efforts to build a more inclusive and representative rare book world for future generations. As one of the 2019 Honey and Wax Prize honorable mentions myself, I can tell you firsthand how impactful Rebecca and Heather's support can be in the life of a young book collector. And I'm so thrilled to welcome them to share their work with you this evening.
Hi, I am Rebecca Romney, and my colleague here, this is Heather O'Donnell, the redhead. And today we are booksellers. So because our primary experience is in the rare book trade, that's where we are going to be focusing for the majority of our comments. That said, the trade is just one part of a larger community that encompasses special collections and libraries, archives, private collectors, auction houses, historians and scholars of the book, and even the publishing industry. And no one part of that community operates in isolation from any of the others.
The rare book trade reflects what our society considers important: the voices that matter, the genres that count, the ideas we value. Why would someone last October pay $10 million for a copy of Shakespeare's 1623 First Folio, a book that is, after all, not particularly scarce? Hundreds of copies survive, and it's exhaustively digitized and endlessly reprinted. Well, it's not a real question. Pay $10 million because it's Shakespeare, whose writing continues to shape our collective frame of reference today. Shakespeare is important. And we have no quarrel with Shakespeare or with Shakespeare collectors, who we love. But the record price commanded by the First Folio exemplifies a fact about our world. The top of the market is dominated by a relatively small group of works, produced, sold, and purchased by a relatively small group of people, with the prices for those high spots getting higher every day. In many ways, it's easier to assemble a traditional high spot collection today than it has been at any other time in the history of rare book collecting. With the internet illuminating most corners of the field, all you need is money. The acquisition of rare book trophies, pursued at record-breaking expense, will always be a part of the book trade. But that is not, to our mind, the most interesting aspect of our work, or a sustainable model for the book trade as a whole and the larger book world going forward.
Yes, an alternative example involves like a similarly hallowed piece of literature, but with a very different story of preservation, and thanks to a single collector. So in the 16th century, during the English Reformation, Henry VIII gutted the monasteries in England. And in the process, many precious books and manuscripts were either lost or destroyed. So many documents once housed in monasteries were treated with disdain that one letter writer from the era noted people were using manuscripts to, quote, scour their candlesticks, some to rub their boots, and some they sold to the grocers and soap sellers as scrap paper, end quote. Enter Robert Cotton. This is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Cotton was a student of the famous historian William Camden, and at the age of 18, he started to gather up as many historical documents as possible. And Cotton's collection includes, by the way, the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf, the great Old English epic poem. It also includes the Lindisfarne Gospels, which contains the earliest translation into English of the Gospels, and the only surviving copy of Gawain and the Green Knight. So without Cotton's obsessive collecting pursuits, these manuscripts would likely have been lost. So a private collector can be, and has been, key to the survival and dissemination of important books. And this is a role that they share with institutional members of the rare book world, but also with rare book dealers.
And Cotton is a perfect example of how even just one sharp-eyed collector has the power to shape what we will consider important by preserving material dismissed as peripheral, minor, even worthless, making possible a later historical reevaluation. Every collector, from the owner of the first folio to the kid with a dorm room piled high with zines, is working to preserve some piece of evidence, some small part of the historical record. This work belongs to all of us, not just to those of us with $10 million to spend on a book. Think of some of the most influential collections of the past century. Native New Yorker Bella Landauer, born in 1874, began her collection with a group of book plates, an established collecting field for bibliophiles. Her obsessive energy soon turned, however, to ephemera printed for business purposes: commercial packaging, invoices, advertisements, stationery, posters, souvenirs, and over 100,000 trade cards. This material was not collectible. It was considered little more than trash. But her vast collection, now one of the most consulted at the New York Historical Society, has been an essential resource for scholars of American history, opening up countless interconnected social histories.
Another example is Mamie Clayton. Mamie Clayton was born in Arkansas under Jim Crow and first moved to New York City and then to Los Angeles, where she worked as a librarian at USC and then UCLA. So while she was there, she began to collect books by Black authors, but soon expanded from books to music, film, folklore, ephemera, all related to the Black community in Los Angeles. And she's a librarian. She was cataloging the material as she acquired it. In this process, too, she starts with essentially transforming her garage and then 2 entire outbuildings into what's known now as the Western States Black Research Center. It's a community library and resource. Our information from this came, by the way, from the Zamorano Club publication, celebrating women in their club, which is a great book if you aren't familiar with it. And I will say also that this particular collection lost its building last year, so it is in a state of limbo. And to me, to us, it's an example of one of the ongoing projects that can use attention in the rare book world, because it's obviously an important contribution.
These pioneering collectors, like Bella Landauer, like Mamie Clayton, have their counterparts in those booksellers who create rather than follow an audience for their material. Think of the English bookseller and historian Elizabeth Crawford, who started dealing in suffrage material in the early 1980s, not just books, but also manuscripts, letters, illustrations, textiles, even teacups related to women's decade-long pursuit of the vote in England. Crawford recalls, the area was regarded by the trade as of little consequence. But her immersion in the material resulted in a series of scholarly books, including the standard reference work on suffrage art, and her 200 catalogs now serve as checklists for institutional and private collectors alike.
And even with relatively newer dealers like Camp Books, which specializes in queer history, like lesbian, gay, bi, trans people, and the associated histories of those groups. Just to give you an idea from their own website, this is by Brooke Palmieri, the founder. Quote, "Queer pasts nourish queer futures. Camp Books specializes in preserving the experiences of LGBTQIA+ and gender nonconforming people across history through rare books, archival materials, and new publications and prints. Our aim is to highlight the story each object has to tell and to promote its use as a tool for education and empowerment." So, I mean, Brooke's writing is terrific. And in a post that they did in Queer Bookselling 1 is the name of the post, definitely worth checking out on Camp Books' website. They hit directly on the point that we're making here. So I'm going to read that too. Quote, "Booksellers," and I would add in this context, collectors, "aren't related to institutions, so they don't have to put up with the hierarchy or questionable sources of money, and they can question institutional tastes and identify and preserve items that get censored in those contexts." Which is to say, you can see how these parts of the ecosystem work together in different ways and capture different elements. I should also say that Brooke's descriptions at Camp Books are, by design, meant to teach queer history on top of selling the items. So even if this isn't something that you collect, just reading those catalogs is an education, and that is the purpose. So I always make sure that I read anything Camp Books puts out. And it's worth noting too that Camp Books is just like the book selling aspect is just one part of this broader sweep of activities that they're involved in. They document, support, and contribute to the larger queer community and the larger print community through a variety of things, because the community building part is the crucial part there.
We do not believe that any small select group, however well-trained, well-funded, and well-meaning, can preserve a truly representative historical record. That is a genuinely collective and democratic project, a project that depends on the active participation and empowerment of collectors of all backgrounds. And we want to see a greater variety of perspectives reflected not only in the material collected, but in the buyers, the sellers, the catalogers, the curators, and the librarians who handle it. We want a range of interests and voices represented at every level of the rare book world, knowing that that kind of diversity will transform not only what evidence is collected, but also what history is written and who writes it.
So each person is a link in a chain of events that leads to our understanding and interpretation of the historical record. So if we work backwards from the biggest points of dissemination, thinking like classrooms or major books and articles by historians and so on, what you see is that that is the point that most people get their information. But how are these historians writing these books? How are the teachers getting this material? Well, the books and research are being done in special collections and in archives. Well, how does that material end up in special collections and archives? You have curators, librarians, and other institutional members, conservationists, et cetera, who are taking care to make sure that those things are preserved and accessible. Now, how do they get there from there? Well, like, how do you find them? Oh, you might get them as a gift. You might get them from a collector. You might get them from a dealer. Okay, where do the collectors get them? Collectors might get them from dealers or auction houses, et cetera. And you can see that if material gets filtered out at any step in that process, then it actually doesn't make it to the rest of that sort of chain reaction, right? It won't make it into the books and classrooms because that material literally isn't there to study. So that means that each link in that chain is not like some passive purveyor of the material. At each step, someone with experiences and perspectives unique to them is making decisions about filtering out or adding in material. So our individual strengths and weaknesses and our expertise and our personal interests, they have an active effect on this process, this chain reaction. And yet that whole chain is a community effort. It's a shared goal. So the question is how we can better support individual contributions within a larger community framework. And thus the strategy of focused community building efforts can increase our opportunities to reach that shared goal.
To this end, we'd like to survey some recent outreach and community building efforts in the rare book world and share the concrete results that we've seen from them. The programs we're about to discuss, in addition to recent initiatives created by Rare Book School, BSA, the Bibliographical Society of America, and RBMS, the Rare Book and Manuscript section of the ALA, are part of a broader movement to attract and support booksellers, collectors, librarians, and archivists from communities historically underrepresented in the rare book world.
And to start, we wanted to talk about the women's initiative within the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, because Heather and I have been involved in this since its founding in 2016. And the impetus for it was actually something that was happening in the UK, in London. There were women booksellers who were getting together, at individual bookshops for just a quick, drinks, just a nice little networking thing. We're getting together, we're getting to know each other, we're learning from each other. And we really liked that idea. And talking with Susan Benet and others who got involved in that initial committee, especially I have to give credit to Susan Benet for really pushing through a lot of these early moments in the Women's Initiative. It led to the beginning of networking events at book fairs for women in rare books and manuscripts. And I will say that networking might seem basic. It might seem sort of like a frivolous, silly thing, like, oh, let's just get together for drinks. But it is actually of high value in rare books. So think about, I am not an expert in medieval manuscripts. So if I am going along and I, have someone offer to me a medieval manuscript, a responsible thing might be to say, this is not my specialty, I'll pass. But that actually doesn't make a ton of sense if I'm the filter for that. And so what I want to do is I want to go to someone that I know who has expertise in that field and say, hey, is this worth something that we should be adding in, or is it something that we should be filtering out? And instead of me having to be a specialist in everything, what I'm doing with this networking is developing this infrastructure where I can actually have people to call on and have additional resources. It's one more thing to give us breadth in what we are preserving for the historical record. So these greater resources really do make a big difference to what we want to accomplish. And we've tried with the Women's Initiative to expand that even further. So beyond the networking events, we started doing panels, which would feature women doing important research, especially of either lost or rediscovered or lesser known contributions of women in various forms. And we've also had ceremonies honoring distinguished women booksellers to say, this is someone who's been doing the work. Carol Sandburg is one of the examples of that, who's been, just an absolute force in California antiquarian bookselling for decades.
And Barbara Rutenberg as well.
Yes, and Barbara Rutenberg. So those are the two we've distinguished thus far. And, this has all been a very important part of preserving the record of women's work in the trade, as well as trying to move forward for the future of women's work in the trade. And a natural outgrowth of this very early on was a Facebook group on this networking theme. So it's called Women in Rare Books and Manuscripts. It's on Facebook. It's now over 2,000 members, over 300, I imagine now. And this group page does a number of really great things on a daily basis. So it boosts the signal of upcoming rare book programming and opportunities. So it talks about, there will be postings about events or classes, book fairs, scholarships, job postings, prizes, the ABA mentorship program, which we'll get up to in a little bit, that type of thing. And it also posts a wide range of rare book content across the board. So that can be scholarly articles or blog posts, or it can be magazine features or dealer and auction listings or book reviews. Much of this is focused on the role of women, but not all. And it offers a place on a social media platform to ask for advice about individual books. So while a lot of these questions have turned out in many cases to be quite basic, the replies often include experts who are generous with their knowledge of print and market history or bibliography. And this has often led the discussions to become deeper than the original questions would have led you to expect. And overall, it creates a space where one can ask candidly about professional expectations and norms, things like degrees, work experience, salary ranges. And that space is also very supportive for conversations dealing with sexism in the rare book world that women still regularly experience. So in other words, its function is similar to Ex Libris. So Ex Libris, most of you probably know Ex Libris. It's a listserv that is primarily academic, but dealers and collectors are part of it as well. you can sort of email, if you need help with research questions and such. So it's similar to Ex Libris, but Ex Libris is a listserv, and this is on a social media site. And so the main difference is that it has a higher focus, the Facebook page, on the personal interactions between those in the community. And it's a slightly more casual atmosphere. And so that encourages less experienced people to participate. But I should say, while we're talking about Ex Libris, it is a long established example of community building. It does have its flaws and issues at times, but it has been a great example of what we were talking about with specialized knowledge and being able to rely on networks to learn things. One example that I thought was great that I saw this last year on Ex Libris was the scholar Kate Osment was working on the Roswitha Club. This was a New York-based club for women collectors in the last half of the 20th century. It essentially arose because Grolier Club did not allow women collectors as members. And so it was sort of the women's companion. And in her work, she was trying to figure out the names of all the members, which sounds simple, but unfortunately in the records, the women's names were listed by not just their married name, but their husband's name entirely. So there would be names like Mrs. Russell Scott, and you're like, who's that? So Kate and her researcher worked to figure out all of the names of these collectors, and there were still about 17 that they couldn't figure out. So they took a call to Ex Libris and Twitter, and researchers from those locations actually came and sort of crowdsourced those answers for them, and they were able to figure out who the rest of these members were. So that's one example of how, this crowdsourced specialization can be really, really effective when you're talking about a discipline like ours, where there are so many specific niche specialties. And one thing that the Women's Initiative, I should just mention at the end here, that is launching here in 2021 is the mentorship program of the ABAA. So that inception was, in fact, from these moments in the Women's Initiative networking events where people would kind of come through, have these conversations at these events, and they wanted to formalize that beyond these informal meetups. They're like, how do I have this more regularly than just to book fairs? This is something that's of value to me. I'd like to see more of it. And so those conversations led to the creation of the mentorship program. And that's something that's noteworthy too, as an example of actions focused on strengthening community benefits for more marginalized members actually benefit the community as a whole.
I am now going to talk about something a little bit adjacent, but also really important in terms of sustaining community in the book world and ideally expanding the number and range of people who participate. And that is the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar, which I know many of you will know, now known as CABS Minnesota, after our move to Minnesota last year. CABS was founded in 1977, and it was originally aimed at librarians who wanted to learn more about collection development. But over the past 40 years, CABS has developed into what it is today, an immersive bookseller boot camp, a crash course in all aspects of the antiquarian book trade, aimed primarily now at booksellers, although librarians and collectors do also attend each summer. Rebecca and I are both CABS graduates, and I'm a current faculty member, along with Brian Cassidy, Rebecca's partner in Type Punch Matrix. We are both strong advocates for CABS as a resource for booksellers starting out in the trade when they are often inexperienced and financially vulnerable and have no network. And to pick up on what Rebecca was just saying, this is a world in which networking is absolutely crucial because the number of things you might need to know is actually infinite. And no one person, no matter how many books they've seen, no matter how many bibliographies they've read, no matter how long they've worked in a shop or an auction house, has seen every book that's been published. And sometimes it is so helpful to be able to run something that's baffling you by one of your colleagues. And many of them will say, I'm not sure what it is, but then there's always that one person who's like, I know it. There was a short-lived publishing project. This is what it is. You need that kind of collective help to be really good at the job. No one can do it by themselves. And so the development of a network is really crucial for anyone who's starting out in the trade. And one of the reasons why people drop out often is because they're trying to do it alone and they just can't manage it. What CABS provides is a uniquely close and bonded community. It's a joke, that we say what happens at CABS stays at CABS, but it really is an opportunity for 1 week for a group of booksellers to be in a supportive place where they can speak freely about their own mistakes and setbacks and ask embarrassing questions without fear of being, condescended to. It's a way of forging a network and providing young booksellers with people they can go to going forward. Each of us, Rebecca and I, both correspond regularly with some of our CABS classmates from when we were students, because we remember that week under the stars in Colorado so fondly. And after CABS, all the members join the CABS listserv, which, like the other resources like Ex Libris, and in a way like the Women in Rare Books and Manuscripts, is a collaborative space where CABS alums can post leads for others on collections that they're being offered. Catalogers can ask for help checking a reference that they don't have in their office. Job postings can reach a broader audience. And questions can be asked openly without fear of snobbery or snark, which isn't always the case in some other places. It's a reminder that we're all on the same team and a way of keeping that sense of community and interconnectedness alive. In recent years, CABS has worked very hard to try to include a broader range of attendees to reach people who were not typically in the pipeline, which is usually junior employees of major rare book firms and booksellers who are starting off on their own, trying to reach people who were really adjacent to the book trade but had an interest in it and weren't sure how to get started. So in recent years, CABS has offered full scholarships to booksellers from communities underrepresented in the rare book world. The Belle DaCosta Green Scholarship and the David Ruggles Scholarship, both of them funded by the great American collector Lisa Baskin, and 3 new scholarships funded by the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation. And a result of that being out there and the goal of diversity being more a part of CABS's open presentation has definitely led to an increased and directly related student-driven focus during the seminar on questions of representation, inclusion, and also ethical sourcing and cataloging of material. The reality is that lots of material from communities who do not have a lot of representation in the rare book world is very profitably handled by a fairly small number of dealers who are not members of those communities and don't always treat the material with the respect it deserves. And so really thinking about how to have a more inclusive group of dealers in the first place, and then to have the dealers who are working now deal in a more responsible and thoughtful way with the materials that they're buying and selling.
Right, and have those conversations that are like, what does it mean that I'm the person handling this, and how do I do this respectfully? Or is there someone else, again, working with people's specialties and saying, okay, maybe I'm not the person for this. Is there someone else? That networking and that community building is really key to really seeing these values through. So we also, of course, want to spend a little bit of time talking about the outreach effort most personal to us, which is the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize for young women collectors. So I'll let Heather talk a little bit about how that got started.
Well, so as Rebecca knows, this got started by me and Rebecca hanging around in the book room at Honey and Wax saying, would it not be great if there was some way to find out what young women are collecting? We had heard so much from senior dealers that women don't collect, that young people don't collect. And we thought that that was probably untrue. However, it was certainly the case, and is to some, still, that young women are not heavily in attendance at ABA book fairs, although that is changing. And we thought, we bet they are collecting. We just don't know what they're collecting, and they're not part of our world, and they don't know about us, and they don't see it speaking to them or their projects. So we set up an annual cash award of $1,000 for a really interesting book collection conceived and built by an American woman, 30 years old or younger. And thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, we've been able to award smaller cash prizes to almost 20 other collectors over the past 4 years. who've received honorable mentions. And beyond that, to connect many more contestants who didn't win any of the money to resources that have helped them to refine and build their collections. Our real goal with this was not so much about the winners. I mean, we're happy to give money to people who are doing fantastically interesting things, but because in writing about them and shining a spotlight on what they've accomplished, we hope that there are many, many thousands of people who read that coverage in LitHub or the Paris Review and think, oh, I like what they're doing. Oh, I could do something like that. Oh, I actually have kind of started something like that. Even if these are people who will never write an essay and do an annotated bibliography for our prize, even if they're never going to be a contestant, the fact that it would validate an impulse in them to preserve the things that they love, to go hard on the things that are most idiosyncratic and unusual and eccentric about themselves, and preserve that without feelings of embarrassment or shame.
Yes, in fact, when we first started thinking about this prize and executing it, we really saw it as a way to promote and celebrate these collectors. And then we sort of had a changing relationship to it, which is to say, it became a way for us to think more elastically about what collecting can be as well. It was like this cross-pollination between dealers and collectors, or at least between us and the collectors. And the thing that was great too is that the prize not only increased awareness about these collectors, but it started more conversations. And whenever we talk about this, we've both given lectures on the prize, we see people's wheels, like the wheels turning in their heads. They're like, oh, what could I collect, right? Like, that was a really interesting collection, that one. I liked that one. I like where that was going. What would I do? And that is exactly the impulse that we want and what we have been seeing a prize like this inspire.
And so we're just going to give a few examples of some of the our favorite collections from the past 4 years. Our 2020 winner, Miriam Borden, won last year for Building a Nation of Little Readers, 20th Century Yiddish Primers and Workbooks for Children. So Miriam collects 20th century Yiddish educational materials, the language primers that form the core of her collection, songbooks and workbooks, flashcards, scripts from school plays. These artifacts testify to a once thriving Yiddish school system across North America, a network that collapsed after World War II as Jewish immigrants assimilated and Hebrew emerged as the language of the State of Israel. As Miriam observes, there would be no more child readers of Yiddish children's books. As a teacher of Yiddish, Miriam now uses these vintage materials to instruct adults hoping to reconnect with a lost part of their heritage. Miriam's collection represents an impressive effort of historical preservation, but also an inspiring example of how a collection that began as something personal to her eventually became a collective resource. Another collection that we liked very much is that by Caxton member Hannah Batzel, who was an honorable mention in 2019 for Mass Market Colonialist Children's Books, 1870 to 1920, a collection of illustrated children's books exploring how colonialist and imperialist thought was packaged and marketed to Western youth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We admired the pivot in Hannah's collection. So much, many of the collections that we really like started off as one thing and then shifted as the collector realized that the question they were really interested in was slightly different than the one they originally considered. So Hannah's collection began with one goal in mind and took a turn. She was initially attracted to beautiful publishers' trade bindings, but that attraction led to a reckoning with the racist pseudoscience she found in popular 19th century works of natural history, and an exploration of the way that young readers were once encouraged to classify the people of the world. As a book artist, Hannah draws on her collection for inspiration. And this is a quote from Hannah. In my own work, I appropriate the illustrative style of this era's children's books in order to draw a line between them and the modern day results of the ideologies they contain.
And building on that, I want to talk a little bit about some of our earlier honorable mentions who specifically focused on the sort of community aspect of collecting. The first is Cherise Francis. Cherise Francis's collection was called J Expressions, Work from the Literary Community of Southeast Queens. Cherise was mindful of the redevelopment proposed for her neighborhood in Queens. And as part of that expectation, she was beginning to collect books by local writers, most of color, and many of whom are self-published or published by independent presses, essentially outside of the mainstream. She described it as, quote, an effort to highlight and preserve some aspects of the communities that already exist here or existed here before, end quote. And her collection is incredibly wide-ranging. It has chapbooks and zines, artist books, memoirs, novels, poetry, and the key theme here is that it's all writers from Queens. On top of that, Cherise would share this collection with the community at local literary events and set up exhibitions at the local library, so it became a community engagement tool as well. And we love this because we thought this strategy showed a commitment to preserving the books being produced in her immediate time and place. She called it an archive of the now, which we thought was a great phrase. And it provides a local model of collecting that we'd love to see just practiced all over the country. Another example from the early days that gives a great model for community collecting is Caitlin Downey. Her collection is documenting the geisha of Kyoto, 1970 to 2000. So Caitlin collected about 150 original theater programs from the Odori, which are the yearly public dance performances staged by Geisha of Kyoto. And her collection was pursued online and then shared with a virtual community of geisha fans. And so it participates in like this collectible historical or collective historical project where fans are sharing primary sources to reconstruct a landscape of these now lost okiya, these geisha lodging houses and tea houses. So we love this collection not only as a disciplined pursuit of material researched and purchased almost entirely online, but because of its strong emphasis on the community-based benefits. Like Caitlin was inspired to begin this collection to fill knowledge gaps in her online fan community. And then with help from others in that community, she figured out how to find these materials. And then circling back all the way, she brought these materials back to benefit that same community.
So the prize is about to enter its 5th year. And our ongoing goal with the prize is to connect with more and more people. Outreach is a constant challenge. We feel like we've done really well in establishing the Honey and Wax Prize within the book world. People know about it, people are excited about it, but there are so many more collectors out there that we need to reach, and we really want to try to keep welcoming new folks in. This is a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for the rare book world as a whole. You can never really relax, because once you become complacent, you become stagnant, and it's just the same people coming all the time. We really want circulation, cross-pollination. We want lots of people represented. To that end, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America is launching in 2021 its new diversity initiative, and credit has to be given for the many people who have worked hard to make that a reality, especially our current president, Brad Johnson, who's been a really staunch supporter of the diversity initiative. Coming to that, having had some experience with outreach and community building, both in the trade and then seeing it in the broader book world, we go into the diversity initiative asking, what have we learned?
So just thinking about the future and where we are at this moment, to us, it's pretty clear that diversity is the natural effect of an equitable system, not the cause to look to in order to create an equitable system. So we seek more diverse representation within the rare book trade, in part because this will also help us diversify the historical record. And each of us sees material in a different light unique to us, as we've already discussed. And so what that means is the more breadth that we cover, the better for our shared goal. And so in order to achieve that goal, it's just not an extra benefit, like a good cherry on top to create such an environment. It's actually a responsibility. And so as this is something that we're taking concrete actions in the next year, and a lot of conversations are happening about it, we wanted to just take a little bit of time to talk about individual specific actions that are evidence of this underlying philosophy. So the first is creating an infrastructure for more mentorship opportunities across the board. And that's kind of to say that the mentorship program started by the ABA goes hand in hand with the diversity initiative. And to have someone that you can talk to have those resources, to be given that step up into the networking and figuring all of this out, they have to work together. And going along with that is having clear processes of accountability for behavior that harms marginalized individuals in particular as the more vulnerable. And as we hope this lecture has shown, this behavior doesn't just harm individuals, it harms the community as a whole because it undermines our ability to get that breadth that we want in the historical record. So the ABA's inclusion of the anti-harassment language in their code of conduct that happened a few years ago is a great example of that. Another action is a frank assessment of hiring practices in the rare book trade. So traditionally, rare book firms tend to look very in-group for new employees because they're seeking that specialized knowledge. But as one who was once in charge of hiring new employees for 2 different locations at one of the largest rare book companies in the world, as well as for hiring in my own company now, I can speak from personal experience that putting out calls beyond established circles, it is definitely more work, but it is also a tremendous asset to the company. Much of rare book selling is learned on the job anyway, frankly. I mean, that's what the traditional apprentice model shows and why that was so typical of a way to learn, because you really do have to just learn on the job. But then as well, when I hire, I'm not seeking someone to replicate my own skill set, my own experience and expertise. Like, I've already got that area covered. So I want someone who can bring strengths my company lacks and needs. And also, I know that I need to pay them a living wage so that my potential pool of applicants isn't limited to those with some kind of financial cushion. Another concrete action is providing professional training programs. And these, I mean, even for established dealers, not just new dealers. And these programs would make it easier to keep up with, say, the latest scholarship in fields in which they handle material. So one good example of this is that anyone handling material related to slavery in the United States should be using the most up-to-date vocabulary, yet many dealers do not. And this is not just a question of professional obligation to know your field, although that's important, but it's also plainly just good sales practice. So it's beneficial across the board. So the diversity initiative in particular, and the ABA as a whole, are taking some of these steps. So for that, we applaud them and we support them as part of the larger community effort to help this community as a whole fulfill its mandate.
Our focus will continue to be on creating the conditions that encourage the rare book world we want to flourish, rather than on trying to come up with shortcuts or quick fixes. If you, as collectors and members of the Caxton Club, share our goals, what can you do? You have real power. As we say, all parts of the rare book world are intertwined. We're all interconnected, even if we may occupy slightly different positions on the field. You have a lot of power to create the rare book world that you want. One way to create a more inclusive and welcoming rare book world is to do what you're doing right now, participating in fellowship activities within societies like the Caxton. We understand that the Caxton is currently planning an online exhibition of members' books, a way to stay connected as a community during this pandemic year. Rediscover the work of longtime members, welcome new ones, and think of others who might benefit from an invitation. I bet that every member of the Caxton Club knows some young person who has the potential to be a really great and potentially transformative collector, but who doesn't think about it. Invite them, talk to them about what you do and why you love it. Another way to help is to make it financially possible for more folks to participate in the rare book world, especially young collectors. When many people think of rare books, they think of that $10 million Shakespeare folio, and they need to know that there's more out there. In addition to the scholarships at CABS, there are opportunities to help with grants, scholarships, and fellowships at almost every rare book program and institution, from Rare Book School to your local university library to the Caxton Club itself. And finally, don't count out purchasing power. Most collectors have their longtime group of go-to dealers, and we encourage that loyalty. But whenever you go to a fair or browse catalogs online, take a moment to explore what some less established dealers are offering and make a note of any unfamiliar booksellers you like. Rare book dealers are small businesses, And you can make a real impact on a small business by seeking out ways to work with them. You have choices and you have power. Just as with independent bookstores, if you want to see your favorite independent booksellers thrive, then you need to actively buy from them, especially now when so many institutions have put acquisitions on hold. Rebecca and I were talking earlier today about how rare books are individually rare, but rare books as a whole are not that rare. There's always good stuff to buy. And over the course of a career as a collector, you can decide who you buy from and why that matters to you.
And these decisions, I mean, these are active choices. You as a collector have a lot of power and a lot of choices. And these actions collectively are what shape this community. So our sort of finishing question for everyone to mull in the back of their minds, either that or you can mention in the Q&A, but just to take home with you, as it were, is this. What are some other concrete actions members of the rare book community can take to help us reach our shared goal? And we'll leave you with that.
We leave you with that.
And we have a new question from Yvette. She's asking, for the prize application, does the collection need to already be underway, or can an application be submitted for a collection in the making?
Well, the collection does need to be underway because it's a prize for a collection that has been assembled, although it is presumably still in process. I mean, part of the application is to provide a wish list of the 3 books you would most like to add to the collection with an explanation of why that would, help you to realize your goals for the collection. So that's one of the sort of challenges of the prize, as opposed to, say, like an essay competition, where someone who's sort of naturally gifted can like make a pot of coffee, sit down, pull an all-nighter, maybe pull out a great essay at the last minute. No one can really pull out a great book collection at the last minute. A book collection is something that you've worked on for quite some time and is really, you've really gone through. And so a lot of what we're doing is reading applications from people who are in the early stages of collecting and giving them advice about where they might take this over the next few years. And one thing that, as Rebecca was just saying, has been really exciting has been to see people who applied in the first year or the second year coming back in the third and the fourth year with much better collections, because they've had some time to really think about what they want to pursue in this collection and really focus it and make it better.
We have a question from Cheryl Ziegler. She's asking, can you talk a bit about the judging process?
Yeah,
I can start.
Let Rebecca do it.
So this is our prize, so we judge it our way, I guess. So we are definitely not following anyone's rules but our own. And Heather and I both read through all the applications independently, and we kind of make our own grades on a scale, and then we get back together and we discuss. And for the most part, we always tend to pick the same winner, which is, I think, a very good sign of us bringing something very similar to what we want to accomplish with the prize. But then there tends to be a lot of discussion from there. And, one of the main things that we consider a crucial criterion that I think can easily get lost on people who are new to book collecting is that we really want people to be collecting books as historical artifacts. We're less interested in collections that are, I have all of these texts because I want the text. We want to know why this particular copy of this particular book, why this edition. And so that's one of the major bits of criteria that gets lost sometimes, I think, for new collectors. But other than that, it's really a question of execution. I mean, there have been some great ideas that clearly just needed another year. And we've seen actually in our second year, we had an honorable mention that was just built up on their first year's collection that just sort of needed a little bit more time. And then it's just, I don't know, Heather, do you want to add anything? As you can see, it's not exactly scientific, but it is based on specific philosophical principles of what we are trying to communicate with the prize.
As Rebecca was saying, a lot of times, like very young collectors, their collection was based on, they took a class that they loved, and the core of their collection is the books they bought for that class. And then they bought other books on that subject. And so it's a lot of like, Penguin Classics and that kind of thing, which is a great way to start thinking about what you love. But also, I think our feeling is if we look at your bibliography and we can buy all of those books in the exact same edition in 10 minutes on Amazon, then that's probably not going to win. Like, we like to see people who are hunting, and that doesn't mean for expensive things, but it means for things that are specific and unusual, where they say, I really, really loved this copy because I'm collecting this illustrator, and so I needed this Bantam paperback from 1968 because of the cover. It fits into the whole, that kind of thing. That is exciting to us. And I feel like it's a good education for people to realize that a book collection is actually not the same thing as a syllabus or a reading list or a list of my favorite books. A book collection is something that has a point and an aim and a project involved in it. And it's really fun and exciting. And part of the journey is starting in one place and ending up in a different one. We want to see that growth and that narrative. I'd say another thing that is always the case with the collections that win is that, often we get people who have really, a lot of great things, and it's focused enough, but their essay is just kind of like, I love it. I love it. I love fairies. I just love fairies. Fairies are my favorite. This actually never happened. I'm making this up. This is a hypothetical example. There have been no collections but where there doesn't seem to be much sort of real questioning of why they are engaged with this material, just kind of like an enthusiasm for something. The ones that we wind up choosing always have some kind of inquiry behind them. There's something motivating them. It's a project.
Thank you for that. Someone is either making a comment or posing a question to you. They're saying, are you aware that comic book collecting is attracting more women buyers and there are more women writers emerging in the superhero genre?
So we are aware because our winner, not last year.
Sure.
Comics. So our number one winner was someone who collected specifically fan-based comics. And one of the reasons that we really liked the fan-made comics was because her collection, Emily's collection, was focused a lot on getting this material by trade. So in fact, it wasn't even about going and purchasing things. It was, as we were saying, being part of the community and going to these events, going to cons and finding an artist's work that you really like and having a conversation and maybe trading some of your comic book art, your fan art, for theirs. And so it crossed into a lot of things that we thought were really interesting, the fanfic community, comic books, etc. So yes, we absolutely are aware of it, and we are very much in support.
And there you go. They are aware. I'm not seeing any other questions. If you do have more questions, please write them in the chat. I would just like to say that Rebecca and Heather, you've been such a great team together. It's wonderful.
They have been fantastic speakers. The Caxton Club thanks you profusely. Thank you for your time, your energies, your efforts. I began at the beginning that said that the Caxton Club has many traditions. And one of our traditions is that we send a copy of one of our books to each of our speakers. And this book will be a different one than the one that you have seen me send to all these grant winners over the last 3 or 4 years. So it'll be a surprise. I want to thank you again to all those members who are here. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Check us out at www.caxtonclub.org and watch for our email, because we'll also allow you to hear this program again as part of our continuing effort to spread the word. Thanks. This has been a swell, swell evening. See you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
At many places. See you both soon. Good night.
Bye all.
Thank you.